Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast is your one-stop shop for fantasy football news and advice. Can't decide on who to draft on the first round? Going gaga on how to line up your team. We've got you covered. Traditional League, Dynasty League, PPR League, IDP League, even Daily Fantasy Football League. Join us as we break down all the questions of fantasy football. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast.
Alright, and welcome to another edition of the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Kenneth Gruenfelder, and we got a lot to discuss today. We're going to go through a bunch of stuff regarding the NFL Draft, going through the picks. We're also going to get into some Aaron Rodgers stuff because, he's been in the news a lot in the last couple of days since the last time I had a show. And I'm going to talk about some of the teams that I think will increase his fantasy value, keep his fantasy value at the same, or decrease his fantasy value. So I'm just kind of going to go through a couple of teams that I think could be possible destinations for him. And then I'm going to go into another analysis on the NFC South and talk about some of the players that I think are fantasy worthy going into the 2021 NFL season. And then I'm going to finish off with draft or pass, where this time I'm going to take 5 defenses and 5 kickers, and I'm going to determine whether to draft them or pass on them. So let's get right into it. So the NFL Draft happened, and it came and went. It went really fast, and it was really nice to see it look like what it typically does. Obviously going through so much the past year and a half with COVID and the pandemic and all that, and it was nice to see a return to normalcy as we transition from the pandemic and make COVID a thing of the past. So, kind of going through some of the draft picks here, and I'm basically just going to kind of just talk about what I think, if it was a good pick, how is it going to impact fantasy, and how is it going to impact other players in fantasy. So, Trevor Lawrence was obviously the first pick in the draft by the Jacksonville Jaguars, and, it was kind of a no-brainer for them. I mean, I think everybody kind of knew that was going to happen. And you know what, listen, I think he has the potential to be a QB1, and he's definitely going to get taken by some people in your drafts, but I think, more specifically, I think for 2 QB leagues, I think he's a great pick. I think that, he's going to be playing the Texans twice a year, so if you're looking for him as like a streaming option, if your QB is on like a bye week or something, and he's playing the Texans that week, I think, that's when you potentially pick him up. If he goes undrafted, which I don't think he will, because a lot of people regard him as like the next big thing, and he definitely has the potential to be that guy. And listen, he didn't win the Heisman Trophy for nothing, so I think there's going to be some growing pains because Jacksonville doesn't have a lot of weapons. They did draft his teammate, the running back out of Clemson, Travis Etienne. I think that's how you pronounce his name. I'm really bad with that, so I'm not 100% sure how to pronounce it. Travis Etienne, I think that's how you pronounce it. Yeah, so they got him with the 25th pick in the draft. They got that pick from the Rams. I think that was I guess that was that was the pick they got with the Jalen Ramsey trade. So yeah, they got 2 Clemson guys. So I think Trevor Lawrence is going to have, like I said, I think he's going to have some growing pains. They do have some receivers there with DJ Chark and Marvin Jones, who they signed. They brought in Carlos Hyde. They have James Robinson there. So, they got some pieces there. But I don't know how successful that offense is going to be. I think, there's going to be some points in the season where Trevor Lawrence is going to struggle. but I think he can definitely be a strong fantasy option at some point. I don't know if it's going to be this year, but we'll see. I mean, he could definitely have like that, like Patrick Mahomes season, and we just don't even expect it, So I think he can definitely be a great dynasty player. When you do your dynasty leagues, that I would 100% draft him in, because he's going to be a quarterback hopefully for the next 15 years. So, I could definitely see that. And like I said before, when it comes to 2 QB leagues, I think he could definitely be, that third QB that you have on your team. For me, I kind of tend to stay away from rookies, and when their second year comes around, that's when I put my focus on them. But typically when it comes to rookie years, I kind of stay away from them. So, but I think Trevor Lawrence was a great pick for Jacksonville. I think he could definitely be a strong fantasy option. I don't know about this upcoming season just because of the weapons around him. Jacksonville is going to prioritize running the football. Urban Meyer talked about that. They said they want to utilize their running backs, and have ETN be that third down running back, and use James Robinson and Carlos Hyde. So in terms of like their running backs, I think you kind of want to stay away from them too, just because, not to say that they're not going to be productive, but in fantasy they're going to be splitting a lot of time. So I kind of want to stay away from that. But I think Jacksonville did have a great draft, and I think Trevor Lawrence could definitely be a great dynasty player, and he could be definitely a great streaming option. And listen, if you want to take a chance on him and start him in, one of your main leagues, go right ahead. So yeah, Trevor Lawrence was the first overall pick in the draft, and I think Jacksonville, they're building for the future, and let's see what they do. And then moving on to the second overall pick, the Jets picked Zach Wilson out of BYU, and I think everybody kind of expected that. Because, they beat the Rams and they beat the Browns late in the season, and that prohibited them from getting Trevor Lawrence. So they got the next best thing, which was Zach Wilson. And, he did impress on his pro day. He's got a great arm, and, looking at some of his highlights, from that, he throws a nice, smooth, deep ball, at least from one of the clips that I watched. So, you know what? Let's see what he could do with the Jets. I think really for him, in terms of dynasty leagues, he's a potential pick. I think, again, he's kind of somebody I would stay away from in regular leagues. You could take a chance on him in potentially a 2 QB league. But I think for the most part, he's kind of going to be one of those guys that you use as like a streamer option. If he's got a good matchup, then you pick him up and start him. But other than that, I probably would stay away from him, though. Just because, again, the Jets are kind of in a rebuild like Jacksonville, and I just don't think that, he's going to be amazing this year like Trevor Lawrence. I think Trevor Lawrence is going to be a little bit better than him this year. But, who knows? I'm just going based off of the fact that, Trevor Lawrence is really, this, next generational talent entering the league. And, not many people were familiar with Zach Wilson. I mean, the other thing is Clemson is televised like every other week, so you're watching Trevor Lawrence play every week, because he's that, marquee guy in college football. So I think Zach Wilson, again, has the potential to be a good pick when it comes to dynasty leagues, but I think in terms of like the standard leagues and, whatever else, I think he's kind of somebody you stay away from unless he's a streamer option. The Jets, the receiving core is okay. They did draft Elijah Moore to help out in the receiving game, and that was a good pick by the Jets. So, they're trying to add weapons around him. They got a lot of work to do. So, I think that, again, he's going to be somebody that you kind of want to draft if you're doing a dynasty league. Now, the Jets are doing it right. They're trying to build the offensive line. And, they did bring in Corey Davis. They still got Jamison Crowder there. And Denzel Mims will be entering his second season. So maybe, the weapons, kind of gel and, develop a little bit more. And maybe, Zach Wilson can be more successful than I think. But I think, like I said, in terms of, his draft value, I think he's kind of somebody you would draft more towards a dynasty league as opposed to the regular leagues. But again, a great pick by the Jets. So then kind of going down the list here with draft picks, the 49ers drafted Trey Lance. I don't think he's going to start immediately, but I think he does have the potential to start later on in the year. And I think he's somebody that, he's got the best supporting cast around him as opposed to Zach Wilson and Trevor Lawrence. I think that if Trey Lance starts, I think he can be successful with the parts that he has around him. With George Kittle, with Brandon Ayuk, Deebo Samuel, you have Raheem Mostert in the backfield. I think that he could be successful. But again, you got to see how, it actually plays out when he actually starts, when he does start. Now, like I mentioned, he has a great supporting cast around him. So, when he does inevitably start, we'll see what happens. And it's going to be interesting to see what happens with Jimmy Garoppolo. And, if you're looking to draft a quarterback or draft a backup quarterback for fantasy, are you going to want to stay away from him? Because, if he, plays bad or gets injured, it's going to be time for Trey Lance to step up and be the starting quarterback. We've seen these situations time and time again in the NFL, and we might see another situation like that play out in San Francisco. So with the 4th pick in the draft, the Atlanta Falcons took Kyle Pitts, the tight end out of Florida. And this was kind of one of the more interesting picks in my mind. I really haven't, I made like one little mock draft with the first 10 picks, but other than that, really didn't do anything else. But I just felt like Atlanta needed other things, and I thought that, they possibly could have taken a quarterback like Justin Fields or somebody else, or even Mac Jones, but they didn't do that, and they got a tight end that, from Florida, which is, still a very good pick, but I just think that they had other needs that they should have addressed, like the defense, and, maybe even drafted a quarterback, because Matt Ryan is getting up there in age, and he's not going to be around for that much longer. But Kyle Pitts is still a pretty good pick. On the NFL mobile app, it says his comparison is to Darren Waller. So I think he has the potential to be really good because, Atlanta, they really don't have any weapons outside of Julio Jones and Calvin Ridley. And it's a lot of unknowns, really. I know they have Russell Gage there, and, he's had a couple of flashy plays, but Atlanta kind of needs another weapon. And now they bring in Kyle Pitts, and I think he's going to instantly produce because, Atlanta loves to throw the ball. And, like I said, Matt Ryan, is getting up there in age, but he could still produce. And I think that Atlanta's going to put up a lot of points. And, can't really rely on Julio Jones to stay healthy. Unfortunately, Julio's kind of, starting to, he's on like the back nine of his career. And not to say that he's not productive. He's still going to be a very good, productive fantasy player. It's just, he's not going to be as consistent as he was, 5-6 years ago. But, this was a good pick for Atlanta. Makes their offense, very potent. And, you got to watch out for it. But I don't think this makes Atlanta like a Super Bowl contender. Obviously not. But Kyle Pitts, a guy that, is going to be involved in the offense a lot. And I think with the tight end position being very thin when it comes to fantasy, he could be a guy that you can get. And definitely somebody you would want to draft in your dynasty leagues 100%. So I don't know where he would be projected to be taken in regular fantasy drafts. I think he's probably somebody that's going to be taken more towards the middle, late rounds. So it's going to be interesting to see where, he is projected in terms of fantasy. And it'll be interesting to see how people, decide to draft him. So with the 5th pick in the draft, the Cincinnati Bengals selected Jamar Chase, the wide receiver from LSU, who played with Joe Burrow back when they were both in college and playing for LSU. And, for me, and I think a lot of other people, they wanted the Bengals to take an offensive lineman to protect Joe Burrow. But I guess they went with Jamar Chase because, he played with Joe Burrow. He's got the chemistry with him. And, it adds another weapon to the Cincinnati Bengals offense. Now, when it comes to Jamar Chase, again, another guy that you would want to take in, your dynasty leagues. But I think for now, because we don't really know when Joe Burrow is going to come back, so I'd probably stay away from him for now, just because I'm not 100% sure, if Joe Burrow is going to start week 1. Apparently, all the reports are saying he's going to start week 1, so we'll have to wait and see. But, again, it's still a good pick. It's just you would have liked to seen them go with an offensive lineman. And I also think that, if Joe Burrow does end up playing week 1, I think Jamar Chase's value in fantasy is going to go up. Again, he's going to be another guy that's probably going to get taken, mid-late rounds, because of the upside that he has. Again, it all depends on who's playing quarterback. I think if Joe Burrow plays, his value goes up. If he doesn't start right away, Joe Burrow, I think, maybe somebody you might want to avoid. But definitely store away on your bench. He could definitely be a bench player if Joe Burrow doesn't start week 1. But again, if you're doing a dynasty league, he's somebody that you'd want to take. So then the next pick in the draft was the Miami Dolphins. They selected Jalen Waddle, the wide receiver from Alabama, with the 6th overall pick. Honestly, this was a really good pick. Another really good pick. I mean, really when you looked at the first 10, for the most part, everybody that got drafted, you kind of expected to go early. Jalen Waddle was just another guy that, obviously was going to go, in the first round and be in the top 10. But this adds to Miami's arsenal of weapons. He gets paired up with Will Fuller and Devontae Parker and Mike Gesicki. Now, the one thing that I'm concerned about is Tua. Now, Tua, he had some good moments, had some flashes, but, a lot of people are concerned about him going into this season and if he's going to be able to take that next step. And hopefully he's able to because, he's got a lot of weapons around him. They got a pretty good offensive line. They got a running game. They got the tools to be successful. So it really all depends on Tua, how this offense does. And again, Jalen Waddle, another guy that you could definitely draft in your dynasty leagues. And he's probably going to be the same thing with Jamar Chase. I think except, Tua's not injured. It all depends on the quarterback position. If Tua makes big strides in year 2, Jalen Waddle is going to be somebody that, if he's on the waiver wire, definitely pick him up. He's probably going to be somebody that I think for the most part is going to get drafted like late, or, mid-late rounds. Same thing with Jamar Chase. So, he's going to probably start out on your bench, maybe have a flex spot, depending on how he is, though. I mean, if he's, if he develops a chemistry with Tua in this offense, then you know what? His stock is going to go up higher. But, we'll have to wait and see. But again, another good pick. Not really surprised there. Miami's got a lot of good weapons. So, Tua's got to just, take him to the promised land now. So now with the next pick I want to talk about is, one that, kind of upset me as a Giant fan. And that was when the Eagles selected Devonta Smith from Alabama, the other wide receiver. So when the Giants were, like seconds away from, having the next pick, and it looked like, Dallas was going to, have the 10th overall pick, and they ended up selecting Minka Parsons from Penn State, the linebacker. They probably would have did it anyway at 10, but I thought the Giants are going to get Devonta Smith. And then the Eagles just swooped in and took him from us, and I was very upset about that. But it was still a good pick. You saw the pictures online with him holding the Eagles jersey. He did not look really happy, and, I don't blame him considering that the Eagles are, they're a dumpster fire right now. And, he probably would have rather been a Giant, but it's whatever. But you know what? This is great for Jalen Hurts. He gets a wide receiver. They're very thin at that position right now. They got rid of a bunch of their guys like Alshon Jeffrey and Deshaun Jackson, and they just have Travis Fulgham and Jalen Reagor. And listen, Zach Ertz is still on the team, and Dallas Goedert is there as well. So they got a couple of pieces, but nothing nothing too flashy. But Devonta Smith is had a really great season for Alabama, and you know what? Let's see how he does in Philly. But you know what? It gives Jalen Hurts a weapon. So the last pick I want to talk about is the Bears getting Justin Fields, quarterback from Ohio State. Now, I think this is a great pick for the Bears, and he's a guy that probably people are going to leave on the waiver wire for now, because he might not start week 1. Now, I think Andy Dalton, right now is the starter, but he's going to be on a short leash, and if he starts to struggle, Justin Fields is going to get put in, and I think that's going to elevate the Bears' offense. I think, because we know what Andy Dalton is. I think Justin Fields, has more upside. Give the kid a chance. You drafted him, give him a chance, and let's see how he does in training camp, and let's see how he does in preseason. And you know what? If he impresses, maybe he'll start week 1. Who knows? So, Justin Fields, I think, will probably be on the waiver wire, for the most part in most leagues. Again, somebody you might want to take in your dynasty league. Same thing with Devontae Smith. I forgot to mention Devontae Smith, someone you want to get in your dynasty league. But again, it'll probably be the same thing, mid to late rounds. But yeah, so those are the picks I just wanted to get to. And then also, I guess, really quickly, Mac Jones going to the Patriots. He's another guy, same thing as Justin Fields. If Cam Newton struggles, they might put him in. So we'll see. Yeah, so those are kind of the picks I wanted to cover. We'll kind of go through more of them, in the coming weeks, and we'll do more of an in-depth analysis of each player. But yeah, that's kind of my thoughts on, really the top 15, when it comes to fantasy. So yeah, those guys, they're not going to be taken, in the first couple rounds. They're going to be taken more towards like the middle and back end of each draft, depending on what league you're doing. Obviously, if you're doing dynasty, it's a whole different thing. You want to get these guys as soon as possible. But yeah, those are my thoughts on the NFL draft. So with that, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to talk about teams that I think will be the best fit for Aaron Rodgers if he decides to leave Green Bay. So stick around. We'll be right back here on the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. We'll be right back.
Are you looking for the very best NFL and college football podcast? Then check out the GSMC Football Podcast. Get the latest football news both on and off the field. From the NFL Draft to trades to the rumor mill to the NFL Combines, they got you covered. That's GSMCpodcast.com/football-podcast. Get updates on college rivalries, game day insights, and much, much more. It's football talk the way you want it. This show eats, sleeps, and breathes football. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Alright, and we're back here on the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. For segment number 2 of the show, we're going to talk about Aaron Rodgers. So Aaron Rodgers has been in the news a lot recently, came out and said that he does not want to play for Green Bay anymore, according to reports by Adam Schefter from ESPN. And, it's kind of shocking. It's, something that's kind of been building up for a while. Obviously last year in 2019 with reports of, Aaron Rodgers and Matt LaFleur not getting along and all that kind of stuff. And, Green Bay went on to go to 2 straight NFC Championship games. And, it seemed like everything was good, but now, Rodgers wants a new contract and it seems like there's a rift between Green Bay and Rodgers. So Rodgers possibly cannot be playing for Green Bay next season, and it's kind of crazy to think about. But what I wanted to get into is kind of what possible destinations could Rodgers go to that could increase his fantasy value, or, keep his fantasy value at about the same, or maybe even, hurt his fantasy value. So this past season in 2020, I mean, now you could say last year, because now we're moving more towards, 2021 as opposed to 2020. And I've been saying this past season in terms of talking about 2020 a lot over the past couple of shows, so I'm going to try to get away from that and start saying last year. So last year in 2020, Aaron Rodgers threw for 48 touchdowns, 5 interceptions, had 382 fantasy points. And this is, going off of standard leagues. So I kind of want to go through some teams and kind of talk about whether or not they would hurt or help his fantasy value. So, some of these teams, have quarterbacks, set, but I'm kind of, analyzing like how would Aaron Rodgers be on those teams, and how would he benefit from the position players around him, the skill position players around him, and would it be a better situation than as opposed to the situation he currently is in with Green Bay. So let's get right into it. So one of the teams that I think would benefit greatly from having Aaron Rodgers on their roster is the Cleveland Browns. So now, I don't think they're going to move off of Baker Mayfield, but I think if Aaron Rodgers went to Cleveland, I think that would really, kind of increase his draft stock a little bit, just because he has a lot to work with around him, and I would argue he probably has a lot to work with, more so on Cleveland if he was on Cleveland as opposed to Green Bay, because of the 1-2 punch between Nick Chubb and Kareem Hunt. You have Odell Beckham Jr. coming back. You have Jarvis Landry there. You have that offensive line that they, work to build, through the draft and through free agency in the offseason in 2020. And I really think Aaron Rodgers would excel on that team. I really do. But I don't think, Baker would. I don't think they would get rid of Baker Mayfield. I think Baker Mayfield for now is going to be the franchise quarterback for the Browns. And, he really improved from 2019 to 2020, and hopefully he continues to build off of that. So Aaron Rodgers, I think, would be a good fit in Cleveland. Some of the other teams here, I would definitely say another team that Aaron Rodgers would benefit in terms of fantasy, I'm actually going to say the Miami Dolphins. So, in the last segment I talked about how, they draft Jalen Waddle. They have Devontae Parker there. They have Will Fuller. They signed him in the offseason. I think if Aaron Rodgers potentially went to Miami, I think that's another great destination for him. That's a team that really, right now, I think their biggest weakness is the quarterback. And if Aaron Rodgers went there, I think that would be another, great spot for him. And I think in terms of fantasy, he would definitely benefit from that. I mean, I think Devontae Parker and Will Fuller's numbers will be solid as long as they play. And Jalen Waddle, we got to see how he does, going into his rookie season. But, if you got Aaron Rodgers on your team, those guys are going to get a lot of targets. And even Mike Gesicki, too, because I think Aaron Rodgers, over the course of his career really hasn't had like that, consistent player when it comes to the tight end spot. He had a couple of bright spots here and there, with Jared Cook, and most recently with Robert Tonyan, even way back in the day with Jermichael Finley. But, he's never had like a tight end, consistently over the course of his career, like, in terms of Jimmy Graham with like the Saints and, Gronkowski with the Patriots. Aaron Rodgers has never had that tight end, and Mike Gesicki is young, So, again, that would be another good spot for him at Miami. Their points per game would go up, for each receiver. I think, in terms of the running back spot, it's not like Aaron Jones. You have Myles Gaskin there, but I think Aaron Jones is a better player than Myles Gaskin. So, I think that's another great spot for him as well, Miami. Another good spot for him would definitely be really the team that everybody's been talking about in the news is the Denver Broncos. Now, the Broncos currently have Drew Lock as their quarterback. They acquired Teddy Bridgewater from the Panthers, but, I think if they have a chance to get Aaron Rodgers, they did make a strong push for him. I think they're going to try to do that. I mean, we know, back in the day when Peyton Manning was released by the Colts, the Broncos jumped on that opportunity, and, they got Peyton Manning, and they went to 2 Super Bowls, and they won in 2015. Now, albeit Peyton Manning was not the same player that he was, over the course of his career, and, he significantly declined, in that 2015 season, throwing for only 9 touchdowns and 17 interceptions or whatever it was. And, yeah, was not a good fantasy quarterback. But I think with Aaron Rodgers, you put him in that situation, they have the weapons, on offense. They have Noah Fant, who, I think would greatly benefit from having Aaron Rodgers as the quarterback. He's a young tight end, and he's somebody that everybody, over the past couple of seasons has looked to draft in fantasy, and he really hasn't paid off anything. He's been okay. He's had a couple good games, but, hasn't really been that tight end one that people were expecting. And, Cortland Sutton's going to come back from the ACL injury. They have Jerry Jeudy there. They drafted KJ Hamler back in last year's draft. So they got a lot of weapons around them, and I think those weapons would benefit from having Aaron Rodgers on their team. And that would be, a great supporting cast for Aaron Rodgers, And I think, Cortland Sutton, it'll take time for him to come back from the injury, but, he's a solid number one wide receiver in the NFL if he's healthy. And I think his fantasy numbers would greatly increase if he had Aaron Rodgers as his quarterback. Same thing goes for Jerry Jeudy. He was very frustrated, throughout the season with Drew Lock being the quarterback. And, if Aaron Rodgers is in there, I think Aaron Rodgers would, make his stats better too. So I think all of their fantasy draft stocks would increase, and I think Aaron Rodgers would benefit from being on that team. The Broncos are a young, up-and-coming team. They got a lot of young guys on their team. It's not the same team it was back in the 2013 Super Bowl, the 2015 Super Bowl. I mean, there's a couple of guys that are still on the team from that those Super Bowl teams, like Von Miller. But other than that, it's a young team. And you know what? If Aaron Rodgers goes there, I think he can make them an instant playoff team. But I also think that, he would raise the stock, for a lot of players on that team. And, a lot of people would be looking to draft them in fantasy. And, Melvin Gordon, he's a proven running back. He's not, I don't think he's going to be the same running back that he was with the Chargers. I mean, he did have a decent season with the Broncos in 2020. But I think that, this would probably be one of the best supporting casts Aaron Rodgers would ever have if he ended up going to Denver. So another team that I think would benefit from having Aaron Rodgers is the Pittsburgh Steelers. Now, the one thing with the Steelers is the offensive line is a concern. They did, address it a little bit in the draft. They did draft Najee Harris from Alabama, which, was kind of expected. Most people expected them to do that. So the Steelers do have their running back of the future. They brought back Juju Smith-Schuster. Eric Ebron is there. They have Chase Claypool. They have James Washington. They have some of these other guys, Deontay Johnson. So again, those guys, if Aaron Rodgers was on that team, instantly their draft stocks would all go up as well if Aaron Rodgers was on the Steelers. I think that, especially Claypool's numbers, he was inconsistent throughout the year. He did put up solid numbers, though. I think Juju Smith-Schuster's numbers would increase if Aaron Rodgers was on the team. I think that Deontay Johnson's numbers would increase as well. The tight end, Eric Ebron, he was good with the Colts. Did have a couple of okay games with the Steelers in 2020, but really wasn't that tight end one that, people expect. But again, tight end's a very thin spot when it comes to fantasy. And, you got to, it's a lot of hit and miss when it comes to the tight end spot. But, I think, again, Aaron Rodgers, his stock would, he would produce on the Steelers. I think he would. The only concern is the offensive line. That's really the major weakness of the Pittsburgh Steelers is the offensive line. And also he would be a significant upgrade over Ben Roethlisberger. And I've said, in past shows, I think that Ben Roethlisberger's stock is going to be down in this upcoming season. I think he's going to be a guy that a lot of people are going to stay away from drafting because, of what happened really in the wild card game against the Browns. I think a lot of people just were really turned off by that. All the turnovers. He did throw for 500 yards, but, really was pathetic, especially in that first quarter. So I think if the Steelers had a chance to get Aaron Rodgers, I think they would definitely, try to pursue that. And you know what? I think he would also be a good fit on the Steelers as well. All right, so another team that I think would benefit from having Aaron Rodgers on their roster is the New York Giants. So the Giants, they drafted Kadarius Toney from Florida in the draft. They were looking to get Devonta Smith, but then, of course, the Eagles have to come along and just ruin that and trade up with Dallas and get him. So the Giants had to, trade back in the draft, and they, got more picks, and they ended up drafting Toney with their 20th overall pick. And you know what? Listen, Toney is going to be a good player. He was a good player in Florida, and he's probably going to be the slot receiver of the future because Sterling Shepard, I think with this move, I think Sterling Shepard's time with New York is coming to an end. I don't think this season, but I think once Shepard's a free agent or if he is traded, I think that's it. I think we've seen the last of Sterling Shepard. But listen, that gives Daniel Jones more weapons. But I just think that if the Giants have the opportunity to get Aaron Rodgers, I think they should, try to get him because I think there's a lot of unknowns with Daniel Jones still. I mean, the turnovers were an issue his rookie season. He cut down on the turnovers in 2020, but only threw 11 touchdown passes. And that's not good enough when you're the quarterback of the New York Giants. And now you have the weapons around you. You got Kenny Golladay, Sterling Shepard is still there. You bring in Kyle Rudolph, Darius Slayton. I keep, avoiding saying him, but Evan Ingram, you could throw him in there as well. Saquon Barkley is coming back. And now you draft Tony out of Florida to add to that, repertoire of weapons. And, you got yourself a great supporting cast. And I just think the weakness of the New York Giants in terms of their offense is, along with the offensive line, because, the Giants are putting a lot of stock in their guys that they drafted and brought in last year. The quarterback position is the weakest link of the team. And Daniel Jones needs to make huge strides in year 3 if he's going to continue to be the starting quarterback of the Giants for years to come. But if the Giants have the opportunity to get Aaron Rodgers and you bring him in, that would just, again, raise the stock for a lot of these guys. Saquon Barkley's coming back, and I think that would instantly be, I think, Aaron Rodgers' best, running back, ever. Being on the same team as him. Eddie Lacy was really good, Aaron Jones is really good, but Saquon Barkley, he would instantly be one of the best players that Aaron Rodgers has ever played with. Then you got Kenny Golladay, and Aaron Rodgers would benefit from having a big, tall guy going up and getting those 50-50 balls and being a red zone target. And he led the league in touchdown receptions a couple years ago. And then you got Darius Slayton and Sterling Shepard, who are solid number 2, number 3 guys. The Giants were missing that number 1 wide receiver. They bring in Golladay. They have, 2 tight ends with Ingram, with Kyle Rudolph. I think that would instantly be, one of Aaron Rodgers' best supporting casts. And, again, those fantasy stocks, for those guys would go up instantly, I think, because Aaron Rodgers is really a much better quarterback and a much more accomplished quarterback than Daniel Jones. And I think a lot of people would feel more comfortable drafting a lot of these guys if he was the quarterback and not Daniel Jones. But, the odds of that happening are very unlikely. But if Aaron Rodgers did go to the Giants, all those guys, that I just talked about, Shepard and Slayton and Golladay, I think a lot of people would definitely, be more confident in taking a lot of those guys as opposed to if Daniel Jones is the quarterback. But because Daniel Jones is the quarterback, I think a lot of those guys are going to slip into the later rounds. I think Golladay is going to be more towards like the middle, in terms of fantasy drafts. But we'll have to see. Once people start making all their mock drafts and stuff for 2021, we'll see where everybody kind of falls, in terms of mock drafts. So, we'll have to wait and see. But again, Aaron Rodgers and the Giants, that would be another good fit, and I think that would be another team that would help his fantasy stock. I think that if, he's on the Giants, with that supporting cast, I think he would have the potential, once again, to be, one of the best fantasy quarterbacks in the NFL. And let's not forget, the guy won MVP. So, if you're getting the MVP on your team, for all these teams that I mentioned, his fantasy stock is going to be right up there again with all these guys like Josh Allen and Patrick Mahomes and Justin Herbert and, some of the other guys that I haven't mentioned. He's going to be right up there in that conversation again, if he's on these better teams. I think a lot of these teams, would greatly benefit from having Aaron Rodgers on their roster. And I think they would be better supporting cast than what he has over at Green Bay. I really do. I think because when you look at it, Devontae Adams, Robert Tonyan, Aaron Jones, and then really outside of that, Marquez Valdez-Scantling showed flashes, and he was, he came up in big moments, and he also, messed up in big moments. And Allen Lazard, he, came on, and he was really solid. But, a lot of these teams, I think, outside of Devontae Adams, a lot of these teams have more well-rounded weapons as opposed to Green Bay. Even though Green Bay was the number one scoring offense last year, that was in large part because of Aaron Rodgers. So 2 more teams, I'll just go through really quickly before we wrap up this second segment and go to break. One is, I'm going to say the New England Patriots. Now, I know they got Cam Newton, they drafted Mac Jones from Alabama, but I think, that's a situation that I think would benefit Aaron Rodgers because you're getting Bill Belichick. And, the Patriots, they brought in the 2 top tight ends from the free agency class of 2021. And, they bring in Nelson Aguilar, they bring in Kendrick Bourne, they got Sony Michel and Damian Harris in the backfield. I think that's another spot that Aaron Rodgers would go to, and I think he would excel there just because I think that, the Patriots would do everything in their power to make Aaron Rodgers successful. And then really kind of the last team I would talk about here is the 49ers. Now, the 49ers are loaded. They got George Kittle, they got Deebo Samuel, they got Brandon Ayuk, they got all these running backs, with Mostert. They signed Wayne Gallman from the Giants. This is a team that's ready to win right now. And I think if Aaron Rodgers went to that team, I think he would excel there too. Kyle Shanahan loves to run the football. George Kittle would instantly be the best tight end that Aaron Rodgers has ever played with. The receivers are good. They're not Devontae Adams. They're not some of the guys that he's played with before. But you know what? I think that, with Aaron Rodgers, they would have breakout seasons, and I think these guys would go higher in your fantasy drafts. If Aaron Rodgers went to the 49ers, but I think because the 49ers, they drafted Trey Lance, and I think they're still committed to Jimmy Garoppolo. I think that that possibility is not really likely. But again, I think that would be another team that, if Aaron Rodgers went to that team, his fantasy stock would not be hurt by it. It would, help the players, already there. And, I think that would be another good fit for him. So, I don't necessarily think that Aaron Rodgers at this moment is going to go anywhere, but you never know. Now, if he stays in Green Bay, I think he would still have a great season. Robert Tonyan had a breakout season with Green Bay. Devontae Adams was amazing last year. He led the league in touchdown receptions. So, and they brought back Aaron Jones, and A.J. Dillon is going to be the number 2 running back. They addressed the offensive line in the draft. David Bakhtiari is supposed to come back. So if Aaron Rodgers comes back, he's got that other receiver that they wanted in Amari Rodgers, who they drafted from Clemson. And, that was one of Trevor Lawrence's top targets. They bring him in now to pair with Devontae Adams and the guys that they already have there. So, if he stays in Green Bay, he's got a nice supporting cast around him. I think the supporting cast that I talked about, like the Steelers and the 49ers and the Broncos, I think those supporting casts are a little bit better. They just don't have the quarterbacks. I think that, Green Bay still has a good supporting cast around him. And I think really the main reason why Green Bay didn't make it to the Super Bowl was because of their defense, So if Aaron Rodgers stays in Green Bay, his fantasy stock is still going to be great, especially because he's coming off of an MVP season. So do I think Aaron Rodgers is going to get traded? Do I think he's going to retire? I have no idea. I really have no idea. But I think regardless, if he plays this season, whatever team he ends up on, I think he's going to be successful in fantasy. He's going to be one of the top QBs that are going to be taken regardless. So, we'll see what happens. So with that, we're going to take another quick break. When we come back, we're going to do an analysis of the NFC South and talk about some of the fantasy players that I think you're going to want to have on your teams when you start drafting in the summer and in the early fall. So we're going to take a quick break. So stick around. We'll be right back here on the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be, visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
All right, and we're back here on the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast for segment number 3 of the show. We're kind of going to do a analysis of the NFC South and talk about some of the players that I think you're going to want to have on your teams when you start drafting. So let's get right into it. So we're kind of going to go in order, from first place to last place, with the teams, kind of like what I did with the NFC East when I did the last time I did this. So let's start with the Saints. So the Saints, right off the bat, they got 2 players, Michael Thomas and Alvin Kamara, that you should get for your teams. I think Michael Thomas is kind of one of the players that I think is going to bounce back, but I think there is some question marks with him because, I don't know what the relationship is between him and the Saints. He had the suspension. He was injured last year. And, it's going to be interesting to see how he is without Drew Brees, because Drew Brees has been the quarterback for the Saints ever since Michael Thomas has entered the league back in 2016. So it's going to be interesting to see how he plays, throughout a full season without Drew Brees and a different quarterback. And I think it's going to be Jameis Winston. I think Winston's the more experienced quarterback, and I think Taysom Hill's kind of like that gadget player. So I just think that, Jameis Winston's probably the better option. But I think with Michael Thomas, I think his draft stock is going to drop down a little bit. But I think that he's, if he drops out of the first round, I think he's going to be somebody that, you could get in the second or the third round. I think he could still be a solid number 1. And I think he wants to prove something. He didn't really have a good season. He only had 1 touchdown, and that was in the postseason. He had nothing in the regular season. And then Alvin Kamara is a PPR stud. I don't think it really matters who the quarterback is. I think that Alvin Kamara, in terms of PPR, he's going to get a lot of receptions. He's going to, he's really good with, breaking tackles, and he's good, in the open field. And yards after the catch is really important, especially in fantasy. And I think that, if they're doing a lot of dump-off passes and screen passes, he's going to excel in that. And he's another guy that I think, when it comes to fantasy, you're going to want to have on your team. And outside of that, I think Jameis Winston is somebody that, you would want to draft, because I just think that, as much as the turnovers were concerned, with the Bucs, he did have some monster games in fantasy. He put up 30 points in a lot of games because, in large part, a lot of the Bucs games, he was putting up points in garbage time. And, when it comes to fantasy, you want to have that. So I think Jameis Winston is another guy that, maybe, you want to have on your bench. Or if you do a 2 QB league, maybe he's one of the QBs that you get. And I still think the Saints, they did lose some talent, but they are still a talented team. I think that, we'll learn more about them as the season goes on, and, we'll see what they look like when training camp starts, when, the preseason games happen, and then we'll see what they look like when the regular season comes around. But I think Jameis Winston's somebody else you'd probably potentially want to get. And then I guess Taysom Hill, is another guy you could potentially get because he could start, at any point during the season. And also, he's a gadget player. And, they finally made Taysom Hill a player you can get in fantasy. And, they put him as a tight end. And, he's somebody that you can possibly start. For me, I'd probably stay away from him. But again, he's another, possibility there. But outside of that, I don't think there's really anybody else that, really excites me on the Saints in terms of fantasy. They let go of, Josh Hill and Jared Cook, 2 of their tight ends. So we'll see what happens with their tight end situation moving forward. If one of the tight ends emerges on their team as a fantasy option, then, he's somebody you could probably pick up off the waiver wire. Off the top of my head, I think only Adam Trotman is, one of the tight ends that I can think of. But other than that, I don't think there's really anybody else that you'd want to get. And they don't really have a number 2 wide receiver. They got rid of Emmanuel Sanders, so, it's going to be Michael Thomas and whoever else steps up. So, yeah, those are the fantasy players that I probably get from the Saints. And then kind of looking at other teams in the division, we'll go to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, who are loaded, really at every position offensively. You got Tom Brady, who I think is going to be somebody that's going to be a fantasy sleeper again. I anticipate him to have another good season. They're bringing back everybody, and I mean everybody, both offense and defensively. So, I think he's going to have another good season, but, Brady's the guy that kind of, falls in the draft. And, when you're drafting quarterbacks, there's so many good ones that, you kind of want to, build, the rest of your team before you get to the quarterback spot. And Brady's a guy that, gets taken later in drafts now because, he's older. He's 43 or 44. I don't even remember. He's like 100 years old at this point. I mean, the guy, when is he ever going to retire? I think he's going to be a top 15 quarterback in fantasy again. I think that's safe to say. And also, now looking at some of the other players, Leonard Fournette, Ronald Jones, I think those are guys that, potentially you want to get on your teams. I think Ronald Jones is more of the consistent running back. Leonard Fournette was really productive in the playoffs, but Ronald Jones was really the better running back, the better option in fantasy, in the regular season. I mean, Fournette did have a couple of good games, don't get me wrong, but I think in terms of the regular season, Ronald Jones was the better option. And then you just look at the other guys that they have. They bring back Antonio Brown, Gronk is still there, and you have Mike Evans and Chris Godwin. I think all those guys are must-haves on your team. I think outside of Gronk, I think Gronk's kind of, he's not what he was back in 2014, but I think that, he could be a potential backup tight end for you. And, again, the tight end spot is pretty thin, but, I think that he could be somebody that you could have on your bench because, like I said, the tight end spot's really thin. When it comes to Mike Evans and Chris Godwin, I think those guys you got to have on your team. I think that Mike Evans, is one of the best receivers in the league. And, he was definitely a great red zone option for Tom Brady. He had that one game against Denver. He had 2 receptions, and both of those were touchdowns. So, Tom Brady's always looking for him, and I think that, in year 2 of this system, I think they're only going to be even better. And Chris Godwin, he was injured throughout the season last year, but, I think that if he's healthy, he's going to be very productive. And because of that, that's another guy that you might want to have on your team as well. Those guys are definitely going to be taken early. They're definitely going to be taken within the first couple of rounds. And I think that they're going to be, 1,000-yard receivers this upcoming season. And, one of the interesting guys that they have on this team is Antonio Brown. Antonio Brown had a couple of productive games, the 2 games against the Falcons. He was really productive in those. So I think Antonio Brown's kind of one of those, wide receiver 2 flex options, whereas I think Chris Godwin and Mike Evans, they could be number 1 wide receivers in fantasy. Now, sometimes they'll, not do anything. Like Mike Evans has, those games where he does like absolutely nothing and he doesn't produce. And, it is very frustrating as a fantasy player when he doesn't do anything. But I think that, those are guys that, are going to get a lot of targets. Brady, is going to be a lot better this year than he was last year, in this system, as long as he's protected. That's the key. If Brady's not protected, he's not going to be able to do anything, and he does often turn the ball over a lot when he's not protected. But I think that, the Bucs, they really showed you, especially in the playoffs, that when they protect Brady, he's going to pick you apart. So when I look at it, I think the Bucs, they're probably going to be the best team in the division, and they might be the best team in the NFL, again. And I think they have a lot more fantasy options as opposed to the Saints. I think Fournette and Ronald Jones, those are guys that you can get later on in your drafts. Mike Evans and Chris Godwin, you typically want to get a little bit earlier. Brady is somebody you're probably going to want to, not overdraft for. He'll probably be somebody that gets taken later in drafts. I think definitely when it comes to 2 QB leagues, Brady is a solid number 2 QB, and I've had him as my number 2 QB multiple times, and I won my league when I did that. So, with that, Brady's, again, going to be someone you're going to want to take later on in your drafts. Prioritize getting him, in a 2 QB league. And, Gronk, again, could be a waiver wire pickup, but at the same time, I think that, he's kind of not the same tight end that he was. I think he, could be a nice option for Brady in the red zone, of course. That's really where he's, dominant. But I think, you don't want to get guys that are just touchdown dependent and, they don't do anything else. Gronk had a couple of nice games in 2020, but I think he's somebody you can have as your backup tight end or, somebody you pick up off the waiver wire. So, yeah, all those guys I think are fantasy, are good fantasy options. And, unlike the Saints, there's many players on this team, especially offensively, that you're going to want to get. And also, get the Bucs defense too. When defenses start going in your draft, they might be the first defense off the board, so you're definitely going to want to get them. I think their defense is going to be relentless once again. They brought back everybody on the defense, and, they're going to get a lot of sacks, that defense. And I think even the secondary, they're going to get a lot of turnovers too. I mean, the secondary is really young, and, they got the potential to improve and be even better than what they were last year because, a lot of times they struggled, especially in the secondary. And, you saw that in the regular season matchup against the Chiefs. And, they were able to correct all those mistakes when the playoffs rolled around. So, the Bucs defense is a defense you want to look at and definitely get, when you start drafting in your fantasy leagues. So now let's move on to the Carolina Panthers. So there's a couple of players that I think are, fantasy essentials. I think Christian McCaffrey is going to have a bounce-back season. He's going to be the number one pick taken in most drafts, I think. He's the best option when it comes to PPR and standard leagues, specifically PPR because I think that, he excels in the passing game. And, let's see how he does with Sam Darnold. And then also DJ Moore and Robbie Anderson. And I think those are guys that, you were going to want to have on your teams as well. The one thing is Sam Darnold. How is Sam Darnold going to do in this new system? I'm not really too sure. I think that this is going to be the best supporting cast that he has had since he entered the league back in 2018. And I think that, he's going to benefit from it. It's going to be interesting to see what he does, because a lot of people just think that, he's terrible and it's a turnover machine. And, they're right in that regard. He does turn the ball over a lot. Some of it is not his fault necessarily, but sometimes you look at him and you're like, what was that throw? So, Sam Darnold, I don't think is, a fantasy essential. I think that, he's kind of somebody that could be a streaming option, if he has a good matchup. But, we'll see. He's got a really good supporting cast around him. I think, when you talk about the Panthers' defense, you kind of stay away from that because, they really weren't that good last year. They have a couple of guys on the defensive side of the ball that are young, that are, going to improve as time goes on. They're rebuilding. But I think for the most part, you kind of stick with Christian McCaffrey, Robbie Anderson, and DJ Moore. They've all had, they all have really good fantasy value. Christian McCaffrey, if you have if you have the number one overall pick in the draft, I think he's a guy you take almost immediately. He's a must-have on your team. I think he's going to have a bounce-back season. He only played 3 games, but he had 20-plus points in every single game that he played in, because he's the focal point of that offense. And, in 2019, he was fantastic. Had his best season by far since entering the league back in 2017. And then, DJ Moore, he was injured a couple games, but, he came back and he was an 1,000-yard receiver. Robbie Anderson was a 1,000-yard receiver. So let's see what they do with Sam Darnold. That's what I'm curious to see. I think that DJ Moore and not Curtis Samuel. I think DJ Moore and Robbie Anderson, are guys that, you could probably get in the later rounds. I don't think DJ Moore is going to be, taken very high. I think a lot of people did take him high, but, he really didn't live up to the potential. He was still very solid, but I think a lot of people expected him to be, even better than what his numbers were last year. But I think he'll still be productive, and I think that Robbie Anderson's going to be productive as well. I think DJ Moore is kind of a number 2 wide receiver when it comes to fantasy, and I think Robbie Anderson's kind of a number 2, flex option. But, Christian McCaffrey's an RB1. That's a guy you want to have on your team. And, Sam Darnold, again, I think he can be drafted. He could be a backup. If you're doing a 2 QB league, I think he's a guy you can maybe potentially get as your 3rd QB. But other than that, I kind of see him as a streamer option. I think, if he has a good matchup, like I said, you'd probably pick him up, in case your QB's on a bye week or, your QB is injured. That's really the only scenarios that I see Sam Darnold being, looked at in fantasy. All right, so then going to the team that finished in last place in the division, that is the Atlanta Falcons. So, I think defensively, I think you stay away from their defense. They got a lot of work to do on the defensive side of the ball. I was surprised, like I talked about earlier. I was surprised that they took Kyle Pitts as their first pick in the draft. I thought they were going to maybe possibly go after a quarterback, maybe draft Justin Fields, but they're trying to win again, and I don't think the defense is going to be good. We'll see when the season starts. I think you stay away from their defense, but they're going to have a great offense. On paper, their offense, across the board looks really good. Running back position's a little bit questionable, but outside of that, Calvin Ridley, Julio Jones, Kyle Pitts, and then you got Matt Ryan, who's a consistent fantasy option. I think their offense is going to be pretty good once again. I think some of the fantasy values for some of these guys are going to kind of go down a little bit. I think Matt Ryan, I think he's somebody you'll still draft. I think he could definitely be a solid QB2 for you if you decide to take him, especially with the 2 QB leagues, especially, for me, like if he's sitting there and I need a number 2 QB, I'm probably going to take him. I think when it comes to, regular leagues with just 1 QB, I think, he's kind of more as a backup you want to have and, prioritize getting somebody else. But, I still see him being productive, especially because he has a lot of weapons around him. Same thing goes with, like, Julio Jones in terms of, like, production, kind of dipping a little bit because, I think that, he's not as consistent as what he was in years past. Now, I still think he's a solid wide receiver that you want to get, and he's probably somebody that's still going to get taken early because he is Julio Jones, and, that's Matt Ryan's top target. But I think it's going to dip a little bit. I think he could still be your number 1 wideout because, sometimes he still has a tendency to drop, those 30-point games. I don't think you're going to see them on a consistent basis, but, he's still worth drafting. And I think Calvin Ridley, his stock has been going up the last couple seasons. He's been trending up. I think he's somebody that, you're probably going to want to get, when it comes to like the 3rd, 4th round. He's been really good since he's entered the league. He did have a kind of a rough start, but has really kind of settled in. And, I think you even could consider taking Kyle Pitts. I think that, again, the tight end spot is very thin. And, you're going to want to get somebody that, is productive. And in this offense, the passing game, it's a passing league. And, the Falcons, they love to throw the ball. So I think that, Kyle Pitts is going to be another guy that you're going to want to have too. Especially, if you're doing a dynasty league, 100% you're going to want to draft him. In regular leagues, again, like I talked about, I kind of try to stay away from rookies. But, you know what, listen, if he's there and I need a tight end, I'd definitely consider getting him. And then in the running game, they brought in Mike Davis, who was pretty productive, when Christian McCaffrey was out. And, that's somebody else that maybe you want to consider getting. I think that in terms of, RB2s, he's somebody you want to have. I don't think he's necessarily going to be an RB1, like he was with Carolina. I think that was, it was a good option for a lot of people because Christian McCaffrey was out, and he actually was productive. But I don't think he's going to, replicate that. But I think he's still a solid number 2 running back, if you decide to take him. So, yeah, those are kind of like the main guys. I think now Kyle Pitts being on the team, I think that kind of, knocks Hayden Hurst out of, being a guy that you want to take in your leagues. I expected Hayden Hurst to maybe have a larger role considering that, he was kind of like the 3rd tight end on the Ravens, and it looked like he was going to take a bigger role on the Falcons, and it really didn't work out. So could the Falcons maybe cut him after the season? Or maybe he might be somebody that they get rid of, before the season starts. I don't know. We'll have to see. But, they could do 2 tight end sets. I expect the Falcons to put up a lot of points, especially even in garbage time too. But, they do have a lot of players on their team that, can be productive when it comes to fantasy. And, I don't know what it's going to look like, in a year or two because some of these guys, they could be traded. You look at Matt Ryan, they might trade him somewhere. Julio Jones could get traded. There was a lot of trade talks, surrounding Julio Jones over the past couple weeks. Some teams, I think, were inquiring on him. So, I think that offense, again, is going to be productive. And, there are a lot of guys on that team that, I think that are fantasy worthy. So with that, we're done here. Those are kind of the players from the NFC South that I think, are worth consideration when you're drafting your teams. And yeah, so we're going to take another quick break. When we come back, we're going to do another edition of Draft or Pass, and I'm kind of going to be splitting it between defenses and kickers. So I'm going to take 5 kickers and 5 defenses, and I'm going to determine whether I would draft them or I would pass them. And, I might continue to do that segment, more. I'll take more players that I haven't done for that segment and, continue on with that segment. We'll have to see. But yeah, so that's kind of my analysis on the NFC South. So with that, we're going to take another quick break. When we come back, we'll do another edition of Draft or Pass. So stick around. We'll be right back here on the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. We'll be right back.
Are you looking to get your college football fix? Looking to get the latest news on your favorite school's team? The GSMC College Football Podcast is your ticket to all things college football. Join us as we talk college football from the national championship, the college rivalries, the bowl game, to the Heisman Trophy. To which conference is the best? We've got you covered for the Big Ten, SEC, Big 12, the Pac-12, ACC, and everything in between. Download the GSMC College Football Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Alright, and we're back here on the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. For the final segment of the show, we're going to do another installment of Draft or Pass with 5 defenses and 5 kickers. We'll go through the kickers first, and then we'll finish it off with the 5 defenses that I will determine whether to draft them or pass on them. So let's get right into it. So I got 5 kickers here, and the first one is Dustin Hopkins, the kicker for the Washington football team. He played in all 16 games, had 115 points, was productive, was pretty consistent throughout the season. From weeks, from weeks 11 through 14, he had double-digit points, and those were the only times he did have double digits in terms of points, with 10, and then 2 straight weeks with 11 points, and then 13 in week 14 against the 49ers. And then, had a couple of games where he had 8, 9, and 7 points, and then he had 9 points in week 1 against Philly. Now, when it comes to Dustin Hopkins, I think he is a accurate kicker. And you kind of look at some of the statistics from 2020. He was 30 of 32 with extra points, and then when it came to field goals, he was 27 of 34. So, a little bit of some trouble with the field goals, but other than that, the extra points, 30 of 32, was near perfect with that. Now, I don't really know what to expect from this Washington offense. They bring in Ryan Fitzpatrick, who, has the tendency to have, a game where he'll throw 6 touchdowns and no interceptions and throw for 500 yards, and then he'll have another game where he'll have no touchdowns and throw 4 picks. So I don't really know what to expect with this Washington offense. I think they have a lot of nice pieces there. I think really the only concern is the quarterback position. Now, I think Ryan Fitzpatrick has proven that, he can be a reliable option at QB at times, but the consistency, I think, is what is lacking when it comes to him. Now, I think that Dustin Hopkins is somebody that is more of a streaming option, so I'd probably pass on him just because I think there's a lot of concerns with, how Washington is going to be as an offense. Like I said, I think they have a lot of nice pieces. I think if Ryan Fitzpatrick, produces and, is not like a turnover machine, I think that this Washington offense is going to put up some points and, give Dustin Hopkins a good opportunity to, make some kicks. Now, the other thing is, I said, he is a nice kicker to have in fantasy, but, the field goal percentage, it's only 79%. It's not really that good. The longest field goal that he made was 51 yards, and the longest he's made of his career is 56. That's his career long. So, kind of somebody you probably want to stay away from. I mean, if, you're desperate when it comes to kickers, if your kicker's on a bye week or your kicker's injured, maybe he's somebody you want to pick up if he's got a good matchup, but I'd probably pass on Dustin Hopkins. So moving on, we have Nick Folk, the kicker for the New England Patriots. He will be entering his 14th season in the NFL, and in 16 games, he was 26 of 28 from field goal attempts. That's 92%, and the longest he made was 51 yards, and he was 30 of 33 for extra points, and I had 112 fantasy points, and that was great compared to the last 2 years, where in 2017 he had 27 points, missed all of 2018, did not play in 2018, and in 2019 he only had 56 points with the Patriots. But last year he was good. He was a solid fantasy option when it came to kicks. Now, he had a couple of nice games. He had 14 points against the Jets in week 9. He had 12 points against the Raiders in week 3. He had 10 points against the Cardinals in week number 12, and then he had 12 points against Miami in week 15. So, the Patriots, the offense wasn't really that good last year, to put it lightly. They did struggle, but Nick Folk had a pretty good season. And, I think that, he could definitely have a good season again this year. He is getting old. He's not what he was with the Jets, where, he was really good with the Jets. But, I think with the Patriots, they do have better skill position players. I think the offense is going to be significantly better than it was last year because of the weapons that they brought in, because, let's be honest, the skill position players that they had really weren't that good. And, bringing in, the two best tight ends on the market and bringing in guys like Nelson Aguilar and Kendrick Bourne, they're going to be able to move the ball more. And I think now with the full season of Damian Harris, I think he's going to be implemented into the offense a lot more. Hopefully Sony Michel, doesn't get injured like he did last year. I think the Patriots, they're going to be much better offensively, and I think they're going to put up some points. So draft or pass on Nick Folk, I'd probably lean more towards drafting him because I think the Patriots offense is going to be better, and he was reliable last year. So hopefully he can continue that success and build off of that from last year and continue to be a productive kicker for the Patriots in this upcoming season. So the next kicker that I have here is the kicker for the Pittsburgh Steelers, and that is Chris Boswell. Really was kind of on and off last year. He didn't play in every game. I think he missed week 16 and week 17. So he played in pretty much every other game except for those two. But I don't know. I feel like he might be somebody I would stay away from. I mean, looking at the statistics, in 2019 he had 117 points, so that was pretty good. But in 2020 he only had 93. He was 19 of 20 from field goal attempts, had a 95 field goal percentage, but was 34 of 38 from extra points. And some of his best games, he had 12 against the Bengals in week 10. He had 9 points against the Jaguars in week 11. The first 6 weeks of the season, 5-6 weeks of the season, he had 8 points. And he had 2 points in week 2 against Denver. But other than that, he had 8 points, across the board next couple of weeks. And then he had 9 points in week 7 against the Titans. So, he did put up a lot of points. But I don't know. I just feel like with the Steelers' offense, next year, you're really not going to know what they're going to do. I think they're going to struggle next year offensively, mainly because they don't have an offensive line right now. Now, that could all change, and they could shock us, and, we're like, wow, the Steelers really fixed that offensive line. But, as of right now, they really don't have an offensive line. A lot of guys retired. A lot of guys left in free agency. or they just simply got older. And, Ben's getting older, so, he's not going to be what he was 4 or 5 years ago. So, I don't really know what position the Steelers are going to be, when they take the field in September and, throughout the course of the season. Are they going to be a team that's going to score a lot? Or are they just going to be a team that, is going to be put in positions like they were, in the playoff game where they're, not moving the ball, they're turning it over a lot. We'll see. We'll have to see what happens. But, when it comes to Chris Boswell, I'd probably avoid taking him just because of the concerns that I have with the Steelers offense. All right, so the next kicker I have on this list is the kicker for the Philadelphia Eagles, Jake Elliott, who will be entering his 5th season in the NFL. He's 26 years old, was a 5th-round pick back in the 2017 draft by the Cincinnati Bengals, played in all 16 games in 2020, and only had 70 points, which was his career low in terms of fantasy points. Had 127 his rookie season, had 115 in 2018, had 103 in 2019, and had 70 in 2020. And, I don't know what happened to him. He was averaging 8.5 points per game in 2017 and just has been on the decline for the last couple seasons. I don't know what's happened to him. The career long is 61 yards, which he made against the Giants back in, I want to say it was week number 3, I want to say, in 2017. And, that was kind of like his breakout game, and, has really been a reliable kicker. But, last season, 14 and 19 in terms of field goal attempts, which came out to 73% and was 24 of 26 from extra points. But, this is not the Jake Elliott that, people are accustomed to seeing. This is a guy that, was a reliable kicker. And, you look at some of his games, he only had 13 points in week 3, which was the only time he reached double-digit points, and didn't get anywhere above 8 after that. The highest he would get is 7. He had a game in week 6 against Baltimore where he had 0 points. He missed a field goal attempt in that game. There's a bunch of games where he would have 3 points or less. He had 2 points in a couple games too. It just, what happened to him? So, for me, again, he's another guy I'd probably pass on just because, the season he's coming off of, and also because I just think that, the Eagles offense is going to struggle this season. We'll see how they are. They're in a better position now with Devontae Smith from Alabama, the receiver they got. And, they do have a couple of pieces there with, Dallas Goedert, and we'll see if Jalen Reagor could kind of emerge as the wide receiver that they were hoping to get last year. They passed on Justin Jefferson. And, of course, they still have Miles Sanders as well coming out of the backfield. So we'll see what the Eagles' offense looks like. But I think that, coupled with the fact that Jake Elliott really didn't have, his best season, and he's been kind of on the decline, I'd probably pass on Jake Elliott when it comes to fantasy. So the last kicker I have here is Josh Lambo, the kicker for the Jacksonville Jaguars. Only played in 4 games in 2020 and only had 27 points. But back in 2019, he had 126 fantasy points. And in the games that he did play in 2020, he had 11 points in Week 1 against the Colts. In Week 2, he had 6. In Week 7, he had 1 point against the Chargers. And then against Houston, he had 9 in Week 9. So if Josh Lambo comes back, I think he could be a reliable fantasy option. I would probably draft him if he's there because I think Jacksonville is kind of on the come-up. With Trevor Lawrence coming in there, I think Jacksonville is going to be kind of one of those pesky teams that, other teams are not going to want to deal with during the course of the season. And, I think they're going to get put in good situations. I think Trevor Lawrence is going to move the ball, and move the ball for this offense. And I think because of that, Josh Lambo is going to get put in positions where, he could be successful and, put up some points for you. So I would say I would draft Josh Lambo. But again, when it comes to kickers, you typically draft them towards the end. So, best kicker available, he's probably one of them. So Josh Lambo, I would draft. So now, moving on to the 5 defenses that I picked, one of the defenses I have here is the Cleveland Browns defense. Now, the Browns last year, they made a lot of improvements to their team, and they were a playoff team last year for the first time in years, and, they made a lot of improvements. They bolstered that offensive line. They kind of took the ball out of Baker Mayfield's hands to a certain extent. They heavily relied on their running game between Kareem Hunt and Nick Chubb, and even when Nick Chubb was out, they had guys fill in for Nick Chubb, and Kareem Hunt kind of took over as that lead back. Defensively, they were okay last year, but this offseason, they made a lot of additions to the defense. They brought in 2 guys from the Rams secondary. They brought in John Johnson III and Troy Hill, who were both key components for the Rams defense last year, and they also signed Jadeveon Clowney to play opposite of Myles Garrett. So I think their defense is going to be even better. They had a nice draft. They addressed the defensive side of the ball. And because of that, I think that the Browns defense is going to be vastly improved. And, the guys that they brought in between the draft and free agency, their defense is going to be, a team to be reckoned with, on that side of the ball. And I think they're really a well-balanced team. And because of that, I think with Baker Mayfield not turning the ball over as much as he did in his rookie season, and, I just think that the Browns, they're going to be a really good team this year. And I think a large part of that is not only because of their offense, but because I think their defense is vastly improved. And I think that they're a very underrated defense going into the season. So I would draft the Browns defense. So the next defense I have on here is the LA Chargers. They weren't as good as they've been in years past. They did give up 426 points. Last season they averaged 26.6 per game, giving up those points in terms of who they played against, their opponents. Gave up an average of 119 yards per game and 223 passing yards per game, which isn't that bad. The yards per game, they gave up 343, which is kind of around, average, for a lot of teams here. I think they're going to be better on defense next year. I think hopefully when guys are healthy, they've missed Derwin James, who was their big defensive back that they missed the last couple seasons. I think if he comes back, he's going to make a tremendous difference on this team. And, you still have Joey Bosa, you still have Melvin Ingram. They got some young guys that they brought in. I think that, they're going to be vastly improved. And I think now coupled with the fact that, like the Browns, they're going to have a great offense as well, with Justin Herbert, coming back for year number 2 as the quarterback after having a fantastic rookie season. And, the guys that they brought in, on the offensive line in terms of in the draft, I think they're going to be a good defense once again. And I think because of that, I would probably take them into consideration and draft them. Now, I'd probably, they would not necessarily be the first defense I would take, only because I like to have 2 defenses on my team because, defenses sometimes, a lot of them might not necessarily be strong options, and for the most part, people like to stream their defenses. But I think the Chargers, I think they have the potential to be back in like the top 15, top 10 in terms of defenses, and they got guys that can get to the quarterback. So I think the Chargers defense is going to be successful once again, and they would be another defense that I would draft. All right, so the next defense I have on here is kind of one that, I thought was very surprising in how they really didn't perform going into 2020. The Seattle Seahawks, their defense, I thought was going to be really good last year. They bring in Jamal Adams from the Jets. They brought in Quandre Diggs, who they got back in 2019 at the trade deadline. And it just seemed like their defense was going to be productive, but it wasn't productive because of the lack of pass rush that they did not have, which is why they traded for Carlos Dunlap. They cut him, but then they brought him back, I guess, on like a cheaper deal or something. So that's your pass rush, and the pass rush did get better once he was on the team. But they really, they did kind of underperform. I think for them, I'd probably pass on them just because, I'm not really sure, what their defense is going to look like going into, next season, this upcoming season. I think they could be a good streamer option depending on what opponents they play against because, they went up against the Jets and, the Jets scored nothing. I think they won like 40-0, 40-3, something like that. So, I would probably do that, but I'd probably stay away from the Seahawks defense just because they're also playing, they're going to be playing the 49ers twice a year, and they're going to be better. The Rams are going to be better again, and the Cardinals. So, I think, playing against those three teams twice a year, that's going to be tough for people to want to draft them. So I'd probably pass on the Seahawks defense. And another defense that maybe I'd probably pass on is probably the Minnesota Vikings, just because, a couple of years ago they were amazing. They were phenomenal. But, the last couple of years they've kind of, taken a step back. They drafted some corners to kind of replace some of their veterans, and, they were banged up last year. Anthony Barr was out for the year, and I think Eric Kendricks, he was out a couple of games as well. So they really, they're kind of like, they're a different defense than what they were. I'd probably pass on them as well. However, I think, once again, like the Seahawks defense, if they got a good matchup, I'd probably maybe, consider picking them up depending on what matchup they're going up against, because they're going to be playing the Lions this year twice a year, and I don't know how good the Lions offense is going to be. So you might want to pick them up then, maybe against the Bears if Andy Dalton is starting, even though Andy Dalton did beat the Vikings last year, with the Cowboys. So I don't really know what to think of the Vikings defense, so I'd probably stay away from them when you're drafting defenses, so I would pass on them. So the last defense I want to talk about is the Green Bay Packers. So their defense, is very inconsistent. I think that it gives up a lot of big plays. Sometimes they're really bad when it comes to tackling, and you saw that when Dalvin Cook ran all over them when they played the Vikings at Lambeau last season. You saw it in the playoff game against Tom Brady where they couldn't get any pressure. They got one sack, I think, against them. Other than that, they were just letting Brady carve them up in the first half. The secondary was terrible in that game, especially Kevin King giving up that touchdown. So Green Bay's defense, I think depending on the matchup you pick them up, but I think in terms of when you're drafting, I think you kind of pass on them just because, they're another defense that could be very inconsistent. So I probably would look at them more as a streaming option when it comes to fantasy. I wouldn't necessarily draft them. And that concludes another edition of Draft or Pass. So that is all the time we have for today. I thank you for joining us. Make sure to subscribe to our main social media platforms and write a nice review on our website. We greatly appreciate it. So that's it. So with that, I'm Kenneth Gruenfelder signing off from the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. Have a good day, and we will see you next time.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.